time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have back with us live here in the studios, Fred Felleman. Fred Felleman is a candidate for the Port of Seattle Commission, position number 5. So start out, tell us why are you running for position of Port Commissioner here in Seattle?
Well, I started out as a UW grad. I got my Master's of Science in Fisheries and spent a lot of time on the water studying killer whales and how they eat salmon. So I come at it from a pretty different perspective than your average port commissioner. But having worked with the port over 15 years to advance conservation issues, and I became very understanding of the challenges and benefits the port provides. So now I want to make it work for the workers, work for the neighbors, and work for the environment, because being relegated to 2 minutes in a public hearing was not enough for my contributions.
So talk about some of your previous successes prior to now. Last time I had you on, which was like 2010, I thought I said during that interview you'd been doing stuff for like 30 years. So you have quite a track record there that you could touch on.
Well, I came to the Great Northwest in 1980 to go up to the San Juans to work under Ken Balcom at the Center for Whale Research. And since that time, I've learned how great this place can be and wanted to do everything in my power to keep it that way, from the marine side initially and then from the broader perspective. Then this little thing happened in Alaska. You might have heard about the Exxon Valdez. And while my interest in the ships were just sort of like another species on the water, and I sort of took it from a nerd's perspective, what makes those things tick. And then I realized that they can be tremendous threats to the environment, and I committed myself to making sure it doesn't happen here.
And one of the things you worked on was the banning of offshore oil and gas from our coast.
Yeah, sort of after I finished my graduate work, I was contracted to look for places that would be suitable for National Marine Sanctuary designation in the Pacific Northwest. And these aren't like places that you put under a bell jar and do nothing in, but identifying those uses of the marine environment that will allow for sustainable long-term benefits. So on the Olympic coast, I saw this as some of my most significant experiences in the Northwest was like out at Shai Shai Beach, where you felt like, primordial life was hatched there. So we set aside an area through working through Congress, and then Mike Lowry was our congressman back there. And I wrote the draft environmental impact statements for this area. And so an area the size of Puerto Rico is now banned from offshore oil and gas development. Ships have to go some 40 miles offshore. They can't just cut the corner. And airplanes can't fly below 2,000 feet, all in the course of protecting this spectacular longer strip of wilderness park. And but it's home to 4 Native American tribes. And these folks aren't about no use, but they're all about sustainable use. So it's about putting renewables ahead of one-time extractions.
And you were involved in getting a tug to deal with potential oil disasters?
So yeah, that was a little 20-year project. What I lack in talent, I make up for in perseverance, is one of my more favorite sayings. But so once you have a special area like that and you do certain things that advance the conservation, you see that there's still ongoing threats. And so this is a bit of a catcher in the rye. There's a tug out in Nia Bay, actually operated by Foss Maritime, that has been called out 50 plus times to assist ships in distress. We saw shortly after the Exxon Valdez, there were 2 other Exxon ships, the Exxon Philadelphia and San Francisco, that actually lost power right off that area. So this was one of the simplest pieces of insurance, because our Puget Sound pilots, which are one of the greatest safety measures we have, they don't come on board till Port Angeles. That's 70 miles away. Our tug escorts don't come on board till Dungeness Spit off of Squim. So there was that huge stretch of highly productive and important waters that were unprotected that this tug tries to fill the gap.
Okay, and then finally on my long list, just pick one other. There was the practice of the Navy like to use Copalis Wildlife Refuge to work with their...
Yeah, well, that was all
clients.
sort of associated with the designation of the sanctuary, and that was more with Congressman Dix's efforts. ever since World War II, the Navy used this rock, Copalis. It was actually sea lion rock within the Copalis National Wildlife Refuge. It was just right off of Grays Harbor, the south end of the Marine Sanctuary. And they would use it as target practice in World War II, needing to be able to fight the big war. After a long time, they would say, well, we don't harass the sea lions or the other marine life by we do a fast pass over the top, flush them off the rock, and then bomb it. And they were using duds, but it was still a tremendous source of disturbance as well as to the communities around there. So it was a temporary cessation through the Secretary of Interior, and then Congressman Dick said, well, if you don't need to use it for a little while, we can stop using it. And so the Navy no longer bombs this thing, which is pretty remarkable. I mean, the Department of Defense is a hard thing to get to do environmental stuff. The shipping industry, the International Maritime Organization is a very complicated and hard thing to get ships to go further offshore. Then the tug is a state issue. So over the course of doing this, I've learned both the science of the marine environment, the regulatory environment in which all this stuff occurs, both at the local, state, and federal and international levels. And I really felt that this prepared me to understand the context in which the port operates. Because you can't just go in these things with like good intentions and say, oh, I want to do something positive. You have to know how to get it done. And at the same time, you have to understand the business in which you do your business, because the goal is not to put them out of business. The goal is to have a sustainable use of the marine environment. Now, in the course of doing this, I see this port has tremendous real estate holdings, they have recreational marinas, the cruise ship terminal we haven't even talked about yet, and the airport is like 70% of the revenues of the port, and they have one of the most aggressive expansion plans in the coming years. And then the other major thing that just happened this past year is that the ports of Seattle and Tacoma are combining their efforts in what they call the Northwest Seaport Alliance. So for me, this is fascinating stuff that I'm not looking to advance my political career. I don't have any back to scratch other than the citizens of King County. And it's a broad-based operation that what I don't know, I want to know more about.
So talk more about the cruise ship industry, because again, that was another issue you had significant success with.
Well, I remember when the CEO of Norwegian Cruise Line, the first cruise line to come on the top of Pier 66, which is that right next to the Anthony's in the middle of the seaport, Elliott Bay, and we welcomed big fanfare, and I shook his hand and I said, "Sir, welcome to Seattle. We do it right here." Now, they just signed a 15-year lease. That was like 1999. And they just signed a 15-year lease with the port. Very successful expansion operations for them. And we since built 2 cruise terminals over at 9091 over by Magnolia, the Inner Bay area. But in the course of this huge expansion of the industry, one of the most profitable portions of the port seaport right now, their impacts have been reduced. They no longer discharge anything into the Sound. They were always treating their sewage, but cruise ships are floating cities and right next to shore, and even with their best sewage treatment systems, there's a high degree of ammonia because there's very little water in their flush. I won't get into the details this early in the morning, but and then they used to burn this bunker fuel, which is a highly sulfurous fuel, and the Port of Seattle is unique in that it's really tucked into the city. So the human health exposures were huge. So now part of the berthing agreements, they no longer burn these high sulfur fuels and they no longer discharge it all in the Sound. And this has been a win-win. I mean, I don't think the industry has been thrilled by having the public be an external push on this regard. And they took it on as much through what appears to be, non-regulatory approaches. But we encouraged their behavior, and I think it's been only good for both of us. All of us, I should say.
So talk about some of the primary issues you see for the Port of Seattle and how you would propose to deal with them.
Well, I think the single biggest challenge for the Port of Seattle to advance any agenda is to elevate the public's sentiments towards it. Most people don't know we have a port, no less an elected port commission, until they make some horrible mistake, like trying to lease a oil company without asking for providing Shell this home port without even asking the public what they would want to have in this lease, if at all. It's not like every lease needs this heightened level of scrutiny, but obviously this was likely to have a tremendous amount of public concern given the climate elevation, our awareness right here, and not seeing glaciers on our mountains, seeing our fish not making it back to the streams, the acidification that's not even allowing our shellfish to be able to hatch. So the public here is uniquely attuned to that. Bringing in a rig that's what they call, going into the frontier of the Arctic. Nobody else has gone there. And then to have all the failures that they've had from the previous seasons of attempt, and even coming over from Hawaii on the way over here, they had jerry rill water separator. These are things that Shell was clearly not the company to try to go to the Arctic, and nobody should have been trying to go to the Arctic given the fact we have to keep this in the ground. So if you're going to try to do something that controversial, you have to at least alert the public before you have a non-binding, a non-verbal, a verbal non-disclosure agreement. And they failed miserably. And when the public feels completely alienated by decisions of government, their only alternative is to take to the streets. And the kayaktivists and the lawsuits, both city, state, are obviously expressions of complete frustration and did a tremendous service of elevating the public awareness around the world about this. But it really shouldn't have been necessary. Now, previously we had golden parachutes to our, these port CEOs make $350,000 a year. And 2 CEOs ago, it wasn't enough. And he had to go and get a golden parachute on his way out after what was clearly under the table dealings. Our past CEO, basically at the same time as running a CEO with all that money, was allowed to sit on a board of a freight forwarder that does business with the port and getting an additional $100,000 a year. $350 wasn't enough. These are the kind of things that the public feels rightfully that we're not getting our full value. We're not knowing, and in a sense, is even when they do something good, there's something going on under the table. If we don't increase public support for the port and earn that support, then when challenges come up, whether it be the gentrification of the waterfront or the public support for things like Fisherman's Terminal, which while it doesn't run at a profit, employs all these folks. I mean, the port is the economic engine of this region, whether you know about it or not. And so it's really important, if we're going to maintain a diverse community here, shouldn't have to have a PhD to make a living in Seattle. And this is, I think, critical to the character and health of the Sound. That was why we were founded here. Puget Sound is a natural harbor. We're glacially carved. We can bring in the biggest ships in the world. However, it's getting those containers in and out of a city that's rapidly encroaching upon it that is probably our single biggest challenge. And unless the public supports things like the Landers Street overpass, things that allow the port to do business in the city without heavily conflicting with the other uses of the city, is critical to its long-term success.
So what would you specifically do to bring more transparency?
Well, there's, a simple process in the course of the public hearing process that, having been one of the few members of the public that have been attending Port Commission meetings for the past 15 years, and, it even resulted in me being appointed to the Century Agenda because, I don't know, like I said, I didn't fall asleep in one of the commission meetings. Maybe that was my first credential, but I've been a constructive contributor to the discussions, but I still was relegated to these 2 minutes of contribution at the end of a meeting. And a testimony isn't even like requiring any feedback from the commissioners that were elected by the citizens, all of King County. And remember that on November 3rd, everybody in King County can vote. So I sort of would think that, and then what has been my experience is that citizens and even labor unions that are trying to work out agreements with the port are often dealt with in a rather arrogant fashion. And the agreement gets so far, and then they sort of come to loggerheads. And like there's a discrimination lawsuit at the airport, for example. This has been a problem festering for years. The truckers that do business with the port haven't been afforded a bathroom. I mean, this is basic civil rights issues. And rather than letting these things fester underground and then blow up politically in the elected's face, I would like to invite anybody that's having a challenge with the port to bring it forward in a discussion with the port commissioners, leaving at least a 15-minute chunk at the end of the meeting to elevate it. Now, the port commissioners are not the managers of the staff. The CEO is we hire the CEO. So we can then turn to the CEO and say, we would like to have an update on this in the next week or month or whatever it needs to be. And so we can no longer declare ignorance so that there's a problem. The public knows we are accountable. And ultimately, because we know, the staff are accountable. It seems like just a little bureaucratic nonsense, but I would suggest just the threat of being called to the commission will reduce the likelihood that the public and the labor folks would be at loggerheads for as long. Now that's sort of, bureaucratic minutia that unless you've tried to participate in the port, you don't really get. But there's any number of activities currently slated for future operations that I think are really exciting, like this airport master plan, $2 billion to be spent over the next decade to expand the airport. Now, that's one of the few places where the general public has some interaction with the port. And if anybody stood on the TSA line recently, they can realize that, in fact, the port is way over capacity currently, and it's been the fastest growing airport in the past 5 years. It's like number 13 in the country. If we are going to just even catch up to where we are, it's going to take significant construction and not just, like I said, it's not just good enough for the port to buy carbon offsets to deal with the increased traffic, but I want to see the port actually contribute to the generation of electricity. There's a lot of roof space there at the airport that's going to be created. We can have solar cells contributing to the production. Any number of places, existing warehouses, that this is good for the labor folk who are going to put this material in place, reinforce the roofs. We should be preserving the industrial properties that we have, not selling them off and making them, super efficient. The airport master plan is one of those places where not only the construction, but the layout and how the public deals with the airport will be subject to discussion. Similarly, the whole Fisherman's Terminal, which is really a living museum in a sense. It's operational, but it really shows the public where we came from in a large way. And every time you cross over the Ballard Bridge, you have a little glimpse of it, which is where I live. But sometimes all the ships are gone. All the fish boats are out of there. And they're up in Alaska making a living. But people might think, that port is really, running at a deficit or nobody's home. But in fact, and they have billboards on either side of the bridge that I want the port to have long-term leases of, and explaining to the public, well, these guys are gone, but, the reason why you have fresh fish in your restaurants or at home, and we have the best sustainable fisheries in the world, and these guys are making a real living in this. Ballard does the outfitting of these boats, and we have some of the best ship designers and fabricators. This is some of the real benefits to our area that we all are, receive the largesse thereof. And that area is going through a master plan update. Shilshaw Marina, where I live, they've rebuilt that several years ago, but they never got around to the bathrooms and the showers. And so there's a lot of people there, especially myself, that are excited about that. I won't be voting on that budget, I assure you. And then there's really some very, very exciting. One of the things that there's a clean air strategy between 3 ports: Tacoma, Seattle, and Vancouver, British Columbia, where they've done an inventory of both the conventional pollutants as well as the carbon dioxide that they're putting into the atmosphere. And the goal has been to ratchet this down every 5 years. And so we've gone through this process twice, and this next year we'll have a third look at how we're doing. And I think that's, the responsible thing to do is to first take account of what you're doing and then find ways to ratchet it down. But the real challenge there is the port itself can reduce its carbon footprint all it wants. The major contributors, though, are the folks that call on the port, the giant ships, the airplanes. And we need to create incentives, not just give them gold stars to put on their forehead, but in fact, provide real incentives for early adopters to demonstrate how to do it right. And that includes alternative flight paths to avoid conflicts with the public, using alternative fuels, alternative landing techniques. And there are several airlines that have been experimenting with this, but it should just be sort of standard operating procedure. Again, I think that could be a benefit to the airport's long-term plans as well as the public that is, subject to the obvious conflicts over noise and pollution and things like that.
So at your website, you've talked about green jobs. Maybe you can define that. And it seems that, at least in corporate media, that the whole concept of environment versus jobs, like it's an either or, you can choose one, you can't have both.
Well, this has been sort of the adage ever since the spotted owl debate, loggers versus the owls. And, I was working on the marine sanctuary off the Olympic coast during that time, trying to promote a federal program when people are talking about how owls taste like chicken. It wasn't something, it was actually something very visceral to me. It was really upsetting to be out in the coastal counties. In fact, I was employed by the 4 coastal counties for a year to help them with the management plan for the sanctuary. And then after the shell rig debacle started really heating up, I started having that same uneasiness in my stomach. I go, oh my God, we can go back to this situation where, the interests of labor and the environmental folks are so aligned. In fact, the same things that promote safety, almost all the big shipping accidents of the world is human related. We can't just automate a vessel. But, if they don't have adequate work hours, if they don't have, basic considerations of the operators of the vessels, it will result in disasters. And these guys also have to have time to take care of their families and have retirement programs. And, these are basic human rights. To see us with our basic alignments at loggerheads over a short-term lease was just, to me, and primarily because at the failure of the port's obligations to the public, was just really upsetting to me. And there's still a lot of hard feelings about it. But the fact of the matter is, these are short-term jobs. And, Shell laid off 6,500 people in that period of time. The price of a barrel of oil would, depend, and that's what's dictating our real employment in the working city. And I think we need to be actively seeking the jobs of the future. Now, we're not going to walk away from Alaska, which we've been our 4th largest trading partner since the Klondike. I mean, that's still a very significant part of our business. But we cannot hitch our pony to a dinosaur. We have to look to the future. And I think that's where the growth is. But what the port needs to do is help create the demand that we could then help serve. And could you imagine if the economic and political clout of this billion-a-year organization was helping the governor pass climate legislation or things like that? All of a sudden, we have to produce a certain amount of alternative energy in our state. This will require innovation that hopefully we would generate here, like one company that produces solar cells in the whole state. The fact that we're fabricating these alternative materials for Boeing's airplanes that are now being used by BMW and recycled in Port Angeles. There are things that, unless there's a government requirement to do, we will still be hitched to the price of crude will keep these things to be less competitive. While at the same time people are saying, oh, it's great to get to the pump, at the same time it's preventing us from getting to where we need to be, both from the environment's perspective and for stability in the job market. So we need to get a long-term tenant for Terminal 5. That's where the Shell rig was docked. That's perfectly set up for big ships. Like I said, we have to have that big ship ready. And one of the challenges is you have to have a crane long enough to span the width of these vessels. Ships don't get much bigger than 1,000 foot. I don't think there's shipyards that can build them, but they get wider. And it's that width that makes the crane's challenge to cross, to span the width of. And Terminal 5 is really set up also as on-dock rail, so you don't have the truck traffic. It has a huge expanse of just, parking lot where these containers can be offloaded and sorted. You've seen on these huge ships, there's all sorts of different colored containers from different companies. The various container lines have consolidated, just like airlines and everything else that's going on. So there's really only 3 huge alliances, and as such, these ships are carrying multiple companies' goods. So T5 is beautifully set up to address these challenges.
Just about 1 minute left. So it would require an upgrade there on T5 to be able to accommodate the ships.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons, the Port of Seattle is unique on the west in the United States. LA Long Beach has oil and gas development to fund the port. New York, New Jersey has toll booths. We have property taxes. If you're going to invest, if you're going to get ships like this able to come here, you have to get these tremendous amount of investment in the terminal. It's going to be $230 million to get that terminal ready to create those long-term jobs. Our property taxes are used in part to bond that operation. If the public doesn't support what the port is doing and see the value of those long-term jobs to our community, the property tax becomes vulnerable, and the ability to have jobs of the future become less likely. So that gets back to public support and ultimately our diversity and greatness of this wonderful city.
We're talking with Fred Felleman. He is a candidate for the Port of Seattle Commission Position 5. How can people find out more about your campaign?
That's fredforport.com or fred@fredforport.com. I just got yard signs. I need help distributing them, trying to get mailers out to the public, and you'll soon see a YouTube video on my website, again, fredforport.com. And as an alum and support from King County Democrats, 11 different labor unions, and many others, the Young Democrats as well, we hope to see the public help out. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here today.